A reading from the Infancy Gospel of James, chapter 18. And he found a cave there, brought her to it, and stationed his sons with her, and went to look for a Hebrew midwife in the region of Bethlehem. Now I, Joseph, was wandering, but not wandering. And I looked up to the dome of heaven and saw it standing still, and into the sky. And I was astonished to see that even the birds of heaven were still. And I looked at the ground and saw a bowl lying there, and workers reclining, and their hands were in the bowl, and they were chewing, but not chewing. And they were picking up food, but not picking up food. And they were bringing it to their mouths, but not bringing it to their mouths. Rather, all their faces were looking up. And I saw a sheep being driven, but the sheep stood still, and the shepherd lifted his hand to strike them, but his hand was raised. And I looked into the torrent of the river and saw young goats, and their mouths were in the water, but not drinking. Here ends the reading. Thanks be to God.
Joseph is just getting some rest after the adrenaline and all-night accompaniment of Mary's labor. But the problem is, the Gospels don't have much in between the manger and the temple. In fact, they don't have much about Mary, her birth, or Jesus' infancy at all. It's all shepherds and angels and census. In a week or so, we will have some royal visitors, and only one gospel takes us on the Holy Family's flight to Egypt with a toddler in tow. So I looked outside of the official canon for some more flavor of this holy moment. The Infancy Gospel of James is an ancient text, parts of it written no later than the second century, so about the time or a little later than our other Gospels. Fragments of the ancient manuscripts have been pieced together from here and there, and parts of it are also thought to be additions from as late as the 10th century. Some parts build on stories also told in Matthew and Luke, including Mary's visit to Elizabeth, the Annunciation, Joseph's dream, and the census. So while it is not included in the Bibles in our pews, it was part of a wider canon circulated in early Christian communities, one of several Gospels focused on Jesus' infancy. Both Origen and Justin Martyr, two important early theologians, reference this text, which highlights Mary, her backstory, and offers a much more robust theology of Mary than our canonical Gospels. Hearing this story reminds us that the Christmas stories that we hear in the church, or have heard year after year, are not necessarily historical accounts. They are not necessarily definitive, factual, or complete. Each gospel has its own agenda, and I bring the Gospel of James clearly with my own agenda today. I hope that this might help us remember that the Gospels and birth stories are always political, always theological, always shaped by their context and the narrators. The chapter we heard read this morning caught my attention because it offers us this incredible moment, a moment just before Jesus' birth, a moment of stillness, and a moment which captures our imaginations, a moment where the whole world stops, except for the most important task of bringing a baby into the world safely. In the church, we spend 4 weeks anticipating Christmas. And Advent is supposed to slow us down, yes, but it also builds us up, heightens the anticipation and expectation of Christmas. And of course, secularly, the season before Christmas is jam-packed. Decorations, shopping, gifts, and maybe parties and baking cookies and gingerbread houses and trips to cut down Christmas trees and a little calendar to open each and every morning. And then once we get to Christmas Eve, time flies. Meals devoured, presents torn through in half the time it took to wrap them, pageants done in the blink of an eye, and all of a sudden, it's over. And in churches this Sunday, the Sunday after Christmas, or is it the first Sunday in Christmas or of Christmas, it's often sparsely attended, even without a pandemic. There's not much hullabaloo after the buildup of Christmas Eve. And I know that parenthood is supposedly the longest, shortest time, but I think of Mary, who barely gets mentioned, and wonder, have we just robbed her of her birth experience and stolen the childhood of her baby? I can't help but wonder what might be different if this story was part of the collection of Christmas texts. And if we would read on to hear in the next chapters about the midwives and the actual birth of Jesus in the next chapters. For as much as we talk about how important this child is, we scarcely hear about his mom. And we are quick to jump ahead and get to the part where he has something to offer the world or to us. And that's the reality, isn't it? Babies are cute, but often kind of boring. Kids are precious and precocious, and we spend most of our time and energy on preparing for their futures, rather than enjoying this moment with them or thinking about what they need right now. And we live in a society, one of the only countries in the world, which doesn't provide any paid parental leave. Most birthing parents in this country take less than 6 weeks off, unpaid, for the birth of a child. Women return to the retail floors and fast food kitchens before they even get a follow-up visit with their doctor. So no wonder we do the same to the baby Jesus and his mom. Or maybe it is even because we skip that part of the story for Mary that we devalue it for everyone else. We know our sacred stories of Christmas are deeply imbued in our culture and our institutions. Even as schools have added days off for holidays for non-Christian traditions and religions, winter break and its timing glued to the Christian calendar is sacrosanct. Mary, as we understand her in the other Gospels, is an unspoken model of motherhood, quiet, submissive, pure, a mere vehicle for the arrival of the more important person in the relationship, Jesus. So what would it mean to regard the Christmas story as a birth story and hold it in conversation with frameworks for reproductive justice? The other Gospels offer so little of Mary's perspective, it is hard to know what to do with claims of her virginity, her being told, not asked, if she would like to mother the Son of God, her forced migration in her third trimester, her less than adequate birthing conditions. In the other Gospels, Mary never tells her birth story, her power and experience diminished by the theological agendas about her son. It's always troubled me that in our manger scenes, Mary is often the only woman present. It has troubled me that our Gospels leave out what was almost always included in birth narratives in the Hebrew Bible, the midwives. Mary and Joseph alone in the manger would not only have been lonely and probably historically inaccurate, but also dangerous. Pregnancy and birth without access to informed, experienced healthcare is dangerous, and we know that historically it was women's work. But this 18th chapter of the Infancy Gospel of James tells us a different story, or at least part of that story. It tells us that Mary needed health care. It tells us that birth doesn't just happen anywhere miraculously by the hands of God. No, God needs a person with a womb. And God needs a pair of experienced midwife hands to guide the child into the world. That the most important thing that Joseph could do in the moments before his son's birth was find health care. The world pauses for Joseph to find a midwife. All else stops. No other work continues. Life itself stands still. And of course, Joseph sets out to find a Hebrew midwife, someone with the cultural and medical knowledge, skills, and experience to guide Mary through labor and birth and care for her and their newborn child. This is the most important thing that Joseph could do. And we know because everything around him stops as he focuses on his priority. What would it mean for us to believe that the most important thing we can do to usher Christ into the world is to provide full reproductive health care? In 1994, Black women activists introduced a reproductive justice framework to the then universal health care debate. They posited that reproductive justice moves beyond the binary pro-choice versus pro-life debate and has three core beliefs: the right not to have a child, the right to have a child, and the right to nurture children in safe and healthy environments. More recently, members of the sister song Women of Color Reproductive Justice Collective added a fourth tenet that includes the right to bodily autonomy and gender expression. As legislation languishes with even a meager amount of paid parental leave, as the right to abortion is attacked in our courts and state houses, as Black women in our country continue to suffer some of the worst maternal health outcomes in the entire world, as childcare remains as expensive as rent, the Christmas story, Mary's birth story, reminds us that we have some work to do. So as the world slows this week, we hopefully savor some quiet stillness in our lives, I leave you with my own version of Howard Thurman's classic Christmas poem. When the song of the angels is stilled, when the star in the sky is gone, when the kings and princes are home, when the shepherds are back with their flock, the work of Christmas begins. To find the midwives, to heal the mothers, to feed the postpartum, to release the prisoners, to rebuild the childcare infrastructure, to bring abortion and prenatal care, among others, to make a world fit for Mary and her son. May it be so.